What's up everyone, it's Blue here from Blue Bears Games, and for today's video I am doing a 2-for-1 of sorts. This will be both a customer requested deck and an update to an older budget commander deck I did 3 years ago that featured Tormod the Desecrator partnered with Keskit the Flesh Sculptor. This came about because a customer messaged me asking for a graveyard themed deck, but I didn't have any available at that exact moment. We went back and forth for a bit and we landed on a Tormod deck. I tried to convince him to use a different partner so that the deck would have a second color, but he simply just wanted a mono black graveyard themed deck, and who am I to dissuade them otherwise? The reason for an updated video, however, is because not only have so many new cards been released since I last did that video, but also my theory on building decks for Commander has evolved a little, and this version will be way more fun to pilot than the previous iteration. So let's take a look at what these two commanders do first, and then I'll show you the rest of the deck. Tormod is 1 black and 3 generic mana for a 4/2 legendary zombie wizard with partner and one other ability that is the basis for this deck. That ability states that whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. The or more means that the ability's trigger is a per instance trigger, so each time cards leave your graveyard, no matter how many were moved, you will only get 1 token and not 1 for each card moved. Then Keskit is 1 black and 2 generic mana for a 1/3 legendary Phyrexian human artificer with partner, and an ability that says you can tap it and sacrifice 3 other artifacts and or creatures to look at the top 3 cards of your library and put 2 of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Keskit is more for utility in this build than a focal point. The deck I put together for this customer has a lot going on, and there should never be a time where there isn't something to do, so buckle in because there's a lot to go over. Before I get to it and show you the rest of the 98 though, I want to take a moment to let you know that if you're in the market for an awesome looking deck box, playmat, or sleeves, please visit our sponsor at arcane-fortress.com and take a look at what they have. Their deck boxes are some of the best I've ever used, and you can even get an additional 5% off of your entire purchase if you use discount code BLUEBEAR at checkout. Now let's get to it, and I'll show you what the rest of this budget commander build looks like. So as I usually like to do, I'll start with the lands. This is a mono black deck, so most of it will be swamps, but there are some good utility cards here. So we'll start off with Witch's Cottage. It does count as a swamp. It comes into play tapped unless you control 3 or more other swamps. When it enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. So it moves something out of your graveyard, which is great for Tormod. Mortuary Mire, this one enters the battlefield tapped, but when it does enter play, you put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library with no caveats, and taps to add a black. Memorial to Folly comes into play tapped, also taps to add a black, but you can also pay 3 tap and sack it to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Haunted Fengraf comes into play untapped, taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 3 tap and sack it to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand randomly. So you have to choose randomly the creature that comes back. If there's only 1 creature card in your graveyard, random doesn't really matter, but if there's more than 1, it matters. Buried Ruin comes into play untapped, taps to add a colorless, pay 2 tap and sack it to return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Encroaching Waste, anybody who has seen any of my other budget videos knows that I always put 1 land in every deck that destroys other lands because you just don't know what is out there. There are some really devastating lands. This one you have to pay 4 tap and sack it to destroy a non-basic land. Evolving Wilds, this is not in here for any type of fixing. This is in here to thin your deck of bad draws later in the game. And that's the same thing with Terramorphic Expanse. It just gets lands out of your deck, puts them into play. That way you don't have to draw them later. And then the rest of it's going to be basic swamps. I don't know how many specifically. I don't remember off the top of my head. So I will put a link in the description of this video that shows you the deck list. Moving on to the ramp section, black has 2 options. You can either go with instants and sorceries that give you mana, so like Dark Ritual. I didn't go that route. I don't really like that route because it's temporary mana. I went with more permanent stuff to help you get land into play or go get lands out of your library and put them in your hand. So we start with Renegade Map. It's 1 to cast. It enters the battlefield tapped. And then you can tap it and sack it to search your library for a basic land card and put it into your hand and then shuffle. That's what I went with for a couple of them, and then there's a couple of other ways I did it. Traveler's Amulet, it's very similar to Renegade Map, only it doesn't come into play tapped, and you don't have to tap it to use its ability. It costs 1. The ability costs 1 to do, and then you sacrifice Traveler's Amulet, and you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Moon Silver Key is a 2 to cast artifact that you can pay 1 tap and sack it to search your library for an artifact card with a mana ability, or a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So I don't put Soul Rings in my budget decks because people have them, and I don't have enough for all the decks I make, but this can go search for things like a Soul Ring or an Ashnod's Altar, anything that says that it can add mana to your mana pool that is an artifact. Armillary Sphere is a 2 to cast artifact that you pay 2, tap it, and sack it to go search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, and then shuffle. Mycosynth Wellspring is actually pretty good in this kind of a deck because there's ways for it to be repeatedly used. So it's a 2 cast artifact that when it either enters the battlefield or is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So there are ways to sacrifice artifacts in this deck, so you'll be able to sacrifice it to get the second part of the ability, but then there are also ways for you to get it back, which I showed you one of the lands does, so you can cast it again and get more benefit out of it. So it's really good for deck thinning if you have a way to utilize it. So that's why that's in here. There are 2 creatures I also use for ramp in this deck because you can get creatures back and reuse them. So Wildfield Scarecrow was the first one. It's a 3 to cast 1/4 Scarecrow with Defender. So good stats actually. A 1/4 is a pretty beefy butt just to block with. And then you pay 2 and sacrifice it to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them and put them in your hand, and then shuffle. It doesn't put them into play, but Burnished Heart does. This one is 3 to cast for a 2/2 Elk that you pay 3 and sacrifice it to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So when you're choosing targets to bring back, this is the bit better target over Wildfield Scarecrow because this one actually puts them into play for you. Moving on to the creatures, they are the heart and soul of this deck because all the shenanigans that you're going to pull for Tormod are done with the creatures. We have 3 styles of creatures that I'm going to show you. The first set will be self-returners, ones that can move themselves from the graveyard to somewhere else on their own. We have ones that will be done when they're cast or when they die, so they do others, and then I have utility. So the self-returners are what I call them. Start with Clay Revenant. It's a 1 to cast, 1/2. It's an artifact, so that's nice. And it enters the battlefield tapped, but you can pay 3 to return it from your graveyard to your hand. So that's what most of these cards I'm about to show you do. They do something like that. Haunt of the Dead Marshes is a 1 to cast 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, which is nice. And then you can pay 3 to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, but only activate it if you control a legendary creature. So here's the cool thing. We have 2 commanders for this deck, so you have a better chance of having a legendary creature out anyway. Sanatorium Skeleton is a 1 to cast 1/2 that you pay 3 to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Persistent Specimen is a 1 to cast 1/1 that you pay 3 to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. See how many different places you can put them? Hand, battlefield. One of them may even put it back on top of your library. I don't remember, but it's just different places it can go. Cult Conscript is the 1 to cast 2/1 that enters play tapped, but you can pay 2 and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, but only if a non-skeleton creature died this turn. There are a lot of skeletons in this deck, but there are a lot of non-skeletons, so that shouldn't be an issue. Tenacious Dead is the 1 to cast 1/1 that when it dies, you may pay 2, and if you do, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So it will hit the graveyard, you will choose to pay 2 when it died, and then it goes from the graveyard back to the battlefield. Tapped, of course. Reassembling Skeleton is probably the best version of any of these cards that return themselves. It's a 2 to cast 1/1 that you pay 2 to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. There are no caveats to this one, it's simply just pay 2. Chittering Augur is a 2 to cast 1/1 that can't block. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose a life, which is really good because it also has an ability that says pay 4 to return it from your graveyard to your hand. So you play it, you get to draw a card, sure you lose a life, but that's negligible. And then you use it for some type of shenanigans where you sacrifice it or what have you. And then you pay the 4 to return it back to your hand, play it again, and you draw more cards. It's a nice little, not engine, but it's nice little value. Durable Coilbug is a 2 to cast 2/2. That's simply just you pay 5 to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Brood of Cockroaches is a 2 to cast 1/1 that when it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, or dies, I think is how they word it now, you pay 1 life and return it from your graveyard to your hand at the end of the turn. Brackish Trudge is a 3 to cast 4/2 that enters the battlefield tapped. You can pay 2 to return it from your graveyard to your hand, but only if you gain life this turn, and there are ways for you to gain life in this deck, so that shouldn't be an issue. Silver Smoke Ghoul is a 3 to cast 3/1 that says at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, tapped. It also has an ability that says pay 2 and sacrifice it to draw a card. It doesn't require a tapping, so it can be done when it comes into play at the end of the turn because you gain 3 life. So keep that in mind. It doesn't have to worry about Summoning Sickness because the ability doesn't require a tap. Skeleton Crew is actually a newer card that I just picked up a bunch of because I like what it does. It's a 4 to cast 3/3 Skeleton Pirate
that is a Lord for pirates and skeletons that gives it +1/+1. So it reads as each other creature you control that's a skeleton or a pirate gets +1/+1. And whenever one or more creature cards leave your graveyard, you create a 2/2 black skeleton pirate creature token. Very similar to the ability that Tormod has, so this is actually redundancy. So if Tormod can't come out to play, at least you have another way to do it. The other thing is it returns itself from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped by paying 6. So everything about this deck is included in this card. It's not legendary, so it couldn't be the commander. The last card that has its own self-return is Scourge of Nel-Toth. It's a 7 to cast 6/6 with flying that you may cast from your graveyard by paying 2 black and sacrificing 2 creatures rather than paying its mana cost. So this plays very well in this deck because there are ways to discard cards from your hand. So it will be in your graveyard most likely without having been on the battlefield first, and then you'll be able to pay the 2 and sacrifice 2 other creatures, which may come back later anyway. So really good card for this deck. The next section will be cards that return other things. So stuff like Mirror Retriever, which is a 2 to cast 1/1 that when it dies, you return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Likewise, Workshop Assistant is similar to it, but a little different. It's a 3 to cast 1/2 that when it dies, you return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So the difference is it costs 1 more and it has 1 more toughness. Scrap Trawler, similar to those two, but very different. It's a 3 to cast 3/2, so better stats overall. And whenever it or another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return to your hand target artifact card in your graveyard with a lesser converted mana cost or mana value at this point. Pit Keeper is a 2 to cast 2/1 that when it enters the battlefield, if you have 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Corpse Hauler is a 2 to cast 2/1 that activates for 3 and sacrificing it to return another target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. And then Bone Caller Cleric is similar. It's a 2 to cast 2/1 that you pay 4 and sacrifice it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, but only as a sorcery. And then we have Rieto Sentinel, which I don't know if I said correctly, is a 3 to cast 3/3 construct with Defender that when it enters the battlefield, you have target player mill 3 cards. And then for every 3 you activate into its ability, you can put target card from any graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. So this will move cards from your graveyard to the bottom of your library, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier. It will still trigger Tormod, and if it was a creature card, it will also trigger the Pirate Skeleton. Viconia Drow Apostate is a 3 to cast 2/3 that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. It also has choose a background, so if you wanted to, you could switch this out to be the commander at some point and choose a black background, and there is one in here, so it's possible that might work for you. But it's just another option. It's not really the reason why it's in here. Gravedigger is a 4 to cast 2/2 that when it enters play, return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and he has a twin, Grave Shifter, which is just a shapeshifter changeling version of it. It's another 4 to cast 2/2 that when it enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Whisper is a 4 to cast legendary human cleric that says you can tap it and sacrifice 2 creatures. It can include itself if you wanted to. I wouldn't if I were you. To return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So anything that doesn't return itself that you need back, you can use this to get it back. So that's why that's in here. And I believe of this section, this is the last creature. It is Sivir's Nightmare Speaker, which is a 4 to cast 3/3 legendary creature that is a snake cleric warlock that you can tap and sacrifice another creature or artifact now. And for each opponent, you will mill a card, then return that card from your graveyard to your hand unless they pay 3 life. And again, choose a background, which doesn't really matter, but it may if you want to try something different with this deck that will stay basically the same theme. What I liked about this card was no matter what you choose, your opponent's damned if they do, damned if they don't. They either lose 3 life or you get a creature, or actually not even a creature, you get a card from your graveyard back to your hand. That triggers Tormod. That also triggers other things that I'm about to show you in the next section. These are the utility cards. So we'll start off with Ruthless Knave. It's a 3 to cast 3/2 that has an ability that you pay 3 and sacrifice a creature to create 2 treasure tokens. Then it has another ability that you can sacrifice 3 treasure tokens to draw a card. That's the first utility. The rest of it's going to be stuff that helps you win the game by whittling your opponents down in health. So we'll start with Zulaport Cutthroat. This is not an Aristocrats deck, but it does have some Aristocrats pieces. This is a 2 to cast 1/1 that whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent will lose a life and you will gain a life. Not all of them do that second part. Next is Mirkwood Bats. I actually spent hell just trying to get my hands on these because I ordered them many times through TCG Player, and multiple times my orders never showed up. Made me mad. It pissed me off. I finally got them in to finish the deck. It was the last piece of the deck. It's a 4 to cast 2/3 flyer, which isn't important, but it kind of is because this deck is kind of low on flyers. That whenever you create or sacrifice a token, each opponent will lose a life. This deck will create a lot of tokens, and it will sacrifice a lot of tokens. This could actually end up being the only thing you need to win a game. Doubtful, but it might. Grey Merchant of Ashadel is a 5 to cast 2/4. This is codenamed Gary, by the way. That when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is your devotion to black. I had this in here because this deck gets a lot of creatures back and puts them into play. Repeatedly casting a Gary can actually win you the game on its own. And the last creature in the deck is Dreadhound. This is a 6 to cast 6/6 demon dog that when it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards. That sounds like it would be bad, but in this deck, it's actually good. Also, whenever a creature dies or a creature card is put into your graveyard from a library, this doesn't have to be yours either, by the way. It says whenever a creature dies, not whenever a creature you control dies. It also says whenever a creature card is put into a graveyard, not into your graveyard. When you do that, each opponent will lose a life. So again, more damage whittling down their health so you can eventually win the game. Next up, we'll talk about the instants and sorceries that I chose for this deck. In 3 sections, just like the creatures, this one will have removal, card draw, and then utility. So we'll start with the removal. All of them will be very similar to each other. So we'll start with Bone Shards, which adds an additional cost to cast it after you pay the 1 black. You have to sacrifice a creature or discard a card, but it destroys a creature or a planeswalker. Everything I chose does more than one thing it destroys. Eaten Alive is similar. It's 1 to cast, but as an additional cost to cast this, you either sacrifice a creature, or now you pay 1 black and 3 generic to exile target creature or planeswalker. Spark Harvest is also similar to that, where it's 1 to cast as a sorcery, and your additional cost to cast it is to sacrifice a creature or pay 1 black and 3 generic, but now instead of exiling, you destroy target creature or planeswalker. Powerstone Fracture, similar again, but this one is 2 to cast, and the additional cost to cast it is to sacrifice an artifact or a creature, and you destroy target creature or planeswalker. Necrotic Fumes is a 3 to cast sorcery that's a lesson, which doesn't really matter in this deck. The additional cost to cast this is to exile a creature you control, which hopefully will be a token, and you exile target creature or planeswalker. Feed the Serpent doesn't have any caveats. It's just a 4 to cast instant that exiles a creature or planeswalker. I wanted some things in here that just did it without having any caveats in case a board wipe happens and you're stuck with those cards in your hand. Same thing with Overwhelming Remorse. It's a 5 to cast instant that exiles target creature or planeswalker. However, it will cost 1 generic mana less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. Now we'll move on to the card draw. It's similar to the removal. We start with Corrupted Conviction. It's a 1 to cast instant that as an additional cost to cast it, you must sacrifice a creature, but you draw 2 cards. And Costly Plunder is similar, only it costs 2, and you can sacrifice an artifact instead of just a creature. Reckoner's Bargain, also 2 to cast, very similar to the previous card. As an additional cost to cast it, you can sacrifice an artifact or creature. Only now you draw 2 cards, but you also gain life equal to the sacrifice permanent's mana value. Foreboding Fruit, it's 3 to cast, and you can have target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, but this has Adamant, which means if you paid the cost in all black mana, you also get to create a food token, which is very nice because it's an artifact that you can sacrifice to either gain life or for something else. And then the last section is going to be the utility stuff that just did random things. There's only 2 types of cards in here. The first one is going to be Beacon of Unrest. It's 5 to cast for a sorcery that puts target artifact or creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So now you can put artifacts or creatures onto the battlefield instead of just creatures like I believe my original version had. But the last line says you shuffle Beacon of Unrest into its owner's library, meaning that you can get multiple uses out of this card, which is why it's in here. The last couple of cards are actually tutors. Remember, black is the king of tutors. So we start with the budget versions, obviously. Diabolic Tutor. 4 to cast, search your library for a card, put it into your hand. You don't have to reveal it to anybody. Final Parting is a superstar in this deck. It's a 5 to cast sorcery that lets you search your library for 2 cards. You put 1 into your hand and the other into your graveyard, then shuffle. Most likely, Reassembling Skeleton will be your target to go into the graveyard almost every time. Just a little hint. And then Illicit Shipment is the last sorcery. It is a 5 to cast sorcery that lets you search your library for a card and put it in your hand, but it has a casualty ability of 3. So what that means is, as you cast a spell, you may sacrifice a creature with power 3 or greater, and if you do, you copy the spell. So if you do that, you actually get 2 versions of Illicit Shipment, so you search for 2 cards and put them in your hand. Really good for this deck because it's all about sacrificing things anyway. The enchantment section of this deck only has 4 cards, but the 4 cards I've chosen, not only are they budget, but they're really good at what they do for this deck. So we start off with Necromancer's Stockpile. 2 to cast enchantment that you pay 2 and discard a creature card to draw a card. Then, if the discarded card was a zombie card, you create a 2/2 tapped black zombie creature token. That second part isn't that important. What's important is discarding cards to draw cards. A lot of the creatures in this deck can return themselves from the graveyard to your hand, so discarding them to draw other cards is just really good utility. Endbringer's Revel. It's a 3 to cast enchantment that everybody can pay 4 to return a creature card from their graveyard to their hand. Now, any player can play this, but only as a sorcery, so that means that they can only do it during their own turn when the stack is empty. Yes, that kind of hurts you because they can now do it too, but your deck benefits more for returning creatures from the graveyard to your hand. Agent of the Iron Thrones is the enchantment I was alluding to earlier as the background. It is a 3 to cast legendary enchantment that says commander creatures you own have, whenever an artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. That first line says commander creatures you own. There are 2 commanders in this deck. What that means is if both are on the battlefield while Agent of Iron Throne is on the battlefield, they both trigger for each event. So if you sacrifice an artifact with this and both your commanders out, they will lose 2 life and you will gain 2 life. This is the only background in here, and this is if you choose to change the commander and use a background, this is the one you will use. Last enchantment, love this card, Soul Intervention. It is a 4 to cast enchantment that can be played anytime you can play an instant. It has, whenever it enters the battlefield, target creature gets -4/-4 until its turn, so it acts like removal in an enchantment form. But that's not why it's in here. That's just the bonus. It's in here because whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, each opponent loses life and you gain a life. I said this was like Aristocrats, but I did it in a different way. A lot of things are going to be leaving your graveyard with this deck, so that's how I wanted to do it. This card is a beast in this deck. And finally, the last section of this deck will be the artifacts. Every single one of them is a utility piece, so let me just show you. We start with Witch's Cauldron. It's a 1 to cast artifact that you pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice a creature to gain a life and draw a card. It's only usable once a turn because you have to tap it, but at least it gives you the sack outlet you need and gives you card advantage. And also, it actually gains you a life, which is very unusual for a black card. Vat of Rebirth is a 1 to cast artifact that whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put an oil counter on it. Then it has the ability of paying 3, tapping it, and removing 4 oil counters from it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, but only as a sorcery. This is in here because sometimes stuff happens, and some of the key pieces you need that don't return themselves back to play, they get put into the graveyard, so this will help get them back for you. Mirror Shield. Once again, if you've seen any of my other budget videos, this is the card I use in place of things like Lightning Greaves because it's monetarily less expensive. It's a 2 to cast equipment that equips for 2 and protects the creature on the board by giving it +0/+2 and hexproof. It also gives them this weird thing with Death Touch that I won't really go over, but it does. If you want to read it, you can. Collector's Vault is actually one of the cards that I found to be very good and utilitarian and didn't realize it was going to be as good as it was. It's 2 to cast, and you can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, then discard a card, which, by the way, in a deck where all the stuff can return itself back to you, is not a big deal. But then it also creates a treasure token, so that's actually really important because it's a little bit of ramp, but it's also putting a token into play that you can sacrifice for other things, and when it does die, you've seen I have creatures in here that deal damage to people for you having an artifact go to the graveyard, because remember, tokens go to the graveyard, but then they cease to exist, so that counts. This is a really good card for this deck. Ashnod's Altar. It's a 3 to cast artifact that you just simply sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Desecrated Tomb is a card that when I first did a video for this commander pairing, I didn't have access to because I just didn't open one. I went out and got a bunch of them so that when I remade Tormod again, I could have access to it. It is a 3 to cast artifact that says whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. This is the 3rd card in this deck that says when something leaves your graveyard, create something. This one at least creates flyers, which is very important. And the last card in the deck that I'll talk about is Trading Post, which is a 4 to cast artifact that really is a Swiss Army knife of utility for this deck. It has 4 abilities. You can pay 1 and tap it, discard a card to gain 4 life. You can pay 1, tap it, and pay 1 life to create a 0/1 white goat creature token. You can pay 1, tap, and sack a creature to return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Or you can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. Everything that it does, you actually might want. The only one that's a little iffy is the gaining life, but if you're actually in a bind and you need life to survive, remember, your creatures can come back to you, so discarding one of them to gain 4 life might actually be very beneficial. So there's also the fact that I had the artifact that I told you about earlier, the Wellspring, where if you can find a way to sacrifice it and then get it back, you can actually double up on all the things that it does. This card will enable that.
You didn't think I was going to end this video without showing you an infinite combo for the deck, did you? I hope not, because there is one amongst all the cards I just showed you, and it's full of janky goodness that fits the theme of this deck to a T. It even uses Tormod to work, so let's start there. You will also need a combination of one or both of Skeleton Crew and/or Desecrated Tomb. Having 2 of the 3 works, but having all 3 out works better, but is overkill. Then, we also need Ashnod's Altar, Clay Revenant, and Endbringer's Revel in play as well. That's a 5-card combo right there. I told you it was janky. There is a saving grace though. This is a black deck based on Graveyard Recursion that has tutors, and one piece is in the command zone, so assembling this may not be as hard as you think. If you don't see how it works, let me explain real quick. With all 5 cards in play, the loop starts by sacrificing Clay Revenant to the altar, giving you 2 colorless mana. Use that 2 mana, plus 1 black mana from any source, most likely a swamp, and return the Revenant to your hand. This will trigger whichever 2 of the cards you have in play that create tokens for a creature leaving your graveyard. Cast the Revenant by tapping another source that adds mana to your mana pool, which will leave you with the Revenant out and the 2 tokens now. From here, you will sacrifice all 3 of those to the altar for 6 colorless mana. Use 4 of it to activate the Endbringer's Revel to return the Revenant to your hand. This will create 2 more tokens and leave you with 2 colorless mana floating. Use 1 of that mana to cast a Revenant again and rinse and repeat to your heart's desire. This loop will give you infinite colorless mana, enters the battlefield triggers, casts triggers, leaves the battlefield triggers, and leaves your graveyard triggers. If you add any of the creatures that deal damage for any of those triggers I just mentioned above, you will also get infinite damage as well. My suggestion is Mirkwood Bats, but any of them will work. Don't you just love a good janky combo? And there you have it, my friends, my updated Tormod and Keskit budget commander build that I sell for $40 on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page. While the deck I just showed you in this video is actually sold to someone who requested it, I plan on making similar versions of it available regularly going forward. I feel that this version is much better than the original that I built, and I'm confident that it will be way more fun to play than a lot of the other decks that are out there. I also plan to expand this build eventually by changing out Keskit for other partner commanders and exploring how it will look with different color pairings as well. Looking ahead to next week's video, I have some options between another budget commander build, a special non-deck build video, or start unboxing and upgrading the Lord of the Rings commander precons. I'm not quite sure which direction I'm going to go in just yet, so you're just going to have to check back next Friday to find out. That's all for now, I guess. I want to thank you for watching, and if you could, please do me the favor of giving the video a like, subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so yet, sharing this out to anyone you think would enjoy it, and visiting our sponsor at arcane-fortress.com and using discount code BLUEBEAR for an additional 5% off your entire order if you decide to purchase anything from them. Now, unless you decide to go and watch some of my many other videos, I will see you all next week.